Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's session of the Beginning Farmer and Rancher Lunchtime webinar series. My name is Josh Campbell, and I am the Beginning Farmer and Rancher Extension Program Specialist here at Oklahoma State University. I want to acknowledge the support of the USDA and the U.S. Department of Agriculture's National Institute of Food and Agriculture, USDA NIFA, for their support of this webinar series. The Beginning Farmer Rancher Development Program has made this webinar series possible. We'll jump in today with today's presentation, which is choosing the right business entity for your farm and ranch. And we'll be hearing from Dr. Alex Schaefer, who is an associate professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics at Oklahoma State University. We'll have time at the end for some questions, so please do feel free to ask those questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and I will be available to work out any issues that we're having there. So with that, let's jump into today's session, and thank you, Dr. Schaefer, for joining us today.
Hey, thanks so much, Josh, and welcome everybody. I'm excited to talk to y'all about this issue. I know maybe a lot of you think it may not be the most exciting part of running a farm or a ranch, but I do think it's an important topic. I know maybe many of y'all are kind of starting out and your focus so far has been on either buying equipment or maybe acquiring land, figuring out how to market your products. But choosing the right business structure is another aspect of this farm operation, a business operation that's going to potentially save you money, protect your farm from liability, and make it easier to grow. And so let's go on here. Oops, maybe I don't know how to switch my screen. There we go. Okay, so I think there are a few kind of main reasons why choosing a business structure is important. First is liability protection. So say somebody gets injured on your farm or your cattle get out and cause an accident. The question is, are your personal assets, your home, your car or truck, your personal savings account, are those things at risk from that kind of farm operation? A second thing is taxes and record keeping. So if you have kind of the right business structure, that's going to allow you to save money at tax time or kind of make your finances easier. Farm succession. So if you plan to pass your operation on to your kids or sell it someday, the structure you choose is going to make it easier or harder to make that transition happen. And then finally, financing and investment. So if you ever want to take out a loan or maybe bring in an additional business partner, having kind of the right structure is going to make it easier to do that. So today we're going to talk through some of the different types of business entities. And hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a good understanding of what the pros and cons of each of those different options is. Okay, so first, what the heck is a business entity? And so this is the legally recognized structure for running a business, and it's the way you kind of structure or set up your farm or ranch from a legal and financial standpoint. And how you do so kind of affects how you pay taxes, who's responsible for debt, and how ownership works. And so kind of you can think about this as like a legal wrapper around your business, which determines whether your business is just you personally or operates as a separate legal entity with its own rights and responsibilities. And so that's sort of weird to think about, that your business is a separate entity, but that's how the law treats some of these entities. And so doing so, if you create one of these business structures that the law does treat as a separate entity, that means that the business itself can sue and be sued. It means they can own property, they can take on debt, and they can essentially live forever, right? They can exist even after you or the original owner is gone. And so that kind of separateness is what makes some of these business entities so useful, as they provide kind of a legal and financial shield between you and the operations on your farm. Okay, so let's just quickly run through. Here's a kind of a big overview of the four main types of business structures. And each of these has different rules with respect to liability, taxation, and ownership. So the sole proprietorship option is kind of the simplest structure, and it doesn't have that separation between the business and the owner. A partnership, either a general or limited partnership, is a business kind of like a sole proprietorship. Uh, so it doesn't, again, it doesn't have that legal separation, but it's owned by two or more people who share in kind of the ownership responsibilities and the profits. Corporations are a separate legal entity that offers that liability protection, but they come with several sort of reporting and meeting formalities that you've got to kind of honor. And then the limited liability company is like a flexible hybrid between that corporate approach and the partnership or sole proprietor approach. Okay, so let's talk through these one by one. So looking at that sole proprietorship, this is definitely the simplest form of business. And if you have started a farm or ranch under your name, without registering it as an LLC or a corporation, that means you are automatically a sole proprietor. You don't have to do any additional paperwork. If you've started, you're already operating as a sole proprietor. Um, like I said, the key thing here is that there is no legal separation between you and your business. So you're the same in the eyes of the law and the IRS. Um, that's kind of good and bad, right? So the advantages here, really easy, free to set up. You have full control, simple taxes because it's just your personal tax returns that you're reporting on. So this is a good option if you're kind of a small, low risk operation where you don't expect to have major liability issues or kind of plan to take on partners or investors kind of in the short run. But there comes with a big disadvantage, right? In that because there is no separation between you and your business, you have unlimited liability under this framework, right? So there's no liability protection. If something goes wrong, somebody gets hurt on your farm, or you can't pay off a farm-related debt, you are personally responsible under this business structure. That means they can come after your personal bank account. They could even potentially come after your house if you're operating as a sole proprietor. So kind of the takeaway there, yeah, maybe it's an okay option if you're kind of starting out, but if you're thinking in terms of longer term growth, longer term options, you may want to think about other types of legal entities like an LLC, which we're talking about later to protect your personal assets. Okay. Okay, general limited partnerships. This is a lot like a sole proprietorship, except for that it's got more than one owner, which means that you kind of share responsibility in the decisions across all of those partners. A partnership again is not a separate legal entity. A tricky issue here is that if you incur a debt or something happens on your farm, all partners share equal responsibility for the business and are personally liable for any of the debts or legal claims against the business. So if you and your friends start a cattle business as a general partnership and the business takes on debt, you're both personally liable for paying that back, even if it was kind of the other partner that took on that loan. You, as a member of that partnership, are jointly and totally liable for that responsibility. Kind of one of the benefits of this is that just like the sole proprietorship, it doesn't require any formal paperwork. It does require a partnership agreement, so it's best if that is written. But if it's just an oral agreement between you two, kind of the court honors the terms of those things. Um, Another benefit, so getting more people involved in the business means more skills, capital, labor, but the disadvantages again are the you're on the hook. You're personally liable for the decisions of that company. Um, More people means more disagreements in terms of the management of the business potentially, and there are also dissolution risks. So if one of the partners decides to leave, the partnership is kind of automatically dissolved unless you've agreed otherwise in your partnership agreement. Okay, so beyond sole proprietor, partnership options, corporation is the next business option. And there's a couple types of these. And corporations do operate as separate legal entities from the owners, which means the corporation itself is the one that owns the business, takes on the debt, and can be sued. And so you have kind of the biggest benefit in this structure is the limited liability. Your personal assets are protected if something goes wrong. The cons of this are that it requires a lot more paperwork, a lot more formalities, and because of that, more those additional formalities, these are a less common practice for kind of small ranches and small businesses. Okay, so you see here we got two types of these corporations. The first is a C corp. This is the default structure of a corporation. It's got the strongest liability protections, but it also has this issue of double taxation. So once you make a profit, that profit is taxed at the corporate level, and then when these profits are dispersed to owners as dividends, it's taxed again from your side, right? So if your farm generates $1,000 in profits, your corporation's going to pay those corporate taxes, and then your salary or your dividends from the business, you're going to have to pay your personal taxes for those as well. S corps are a little bit different than that. They avoid the double taxation issue, but there are some restrictions on ownership. Um, Number of shareholders limited to 100, and all of the shareholders have to be U.S. citizens or residents. Another benefit of corporations is they make it easier to raise investments, right? You can just issue stock and attract outside investors. But the disadvantage is you got to do annual filings, you got to hold shareholder meetings, you got to do formal record keeping, which can be kind of prohibitive disadvantages from the perspective of a small farm or ranch. Okay, so the next type of business entity is a limited liability company. And so a lot of people see this as kind of the Goldilocks option between sole proprietors, partners, and the kind of the benefits of corporate ownership. And so this limited liability company is a hybrid structure that allows you to combine that liability protection, so the separate legal entityness of a corporation, but it also allows you the simplicity benefits, the tax benefits of that sole proprietorship or partnership. So you do have kind of the separate legal entity, but you're paying taxes as if you were a sole proprietorship or a partnership. Because of this, a lot of farmers and ranchers think this is the best option for them. You don't have to, so unlike a corporation, you don't have to hold shareholder meetings. You don't have to have kind of those complex corporate formalities. And it's easier to transfer ownership. So this thing, because it's a separate legal entity, continues to exist even after ownership changes. Okay. Okay, so like I said, most people prefer kind of that Goldilocks LLC option, but what you decide is kind of a, there is no one size fits all option, right? So you got to take into account those different liability protections, the different way that taxes are treated, the flexibility of ownership transfer, and kind of what your plans are for succession when you're making these decisions. I guess I should say also that kind of the best thing for you to do if you are trying to choose what is the right business entity for you, it's a really good idea to talk to an accountant or an attorney to make sure that you've got things set up in a way that protects your assets, minimizes your taxes, and supports your long-term goals. Okay, so just quickly, you've talked to your attorney, you've talked to your accountant. How do you formally go about forming a legal entity? So for a sole proprietorship, I said that already. Just that's sort of like magic, right? If you are already operating um, under your own name, that you are, congratulations, you are a sole proprietorship. The same kind of thing happens with a general partnership. If you and your buddy or you and your business partner are operating currently, um, you have to have an agreement between yourselves about how that business is organized. Ideally, that's a written agreement, but it could also be oral, and that creates the partnership. The kind of separate legal entities requires a little bit more effort here. So if you want to create one of those two corporations, a C Corp or an S Corp, you've got to go to the Oklahoma Secretary of State and file articles of incorporation. Uh, Similar process, so you got to pay a fee and then you got to pay kind of annual fees. Um, same thing happens with an LLC. You got to go to the Oklahoma Secretary of State and file something called Articles of Organization. And so here is the link if y'all want to do that, and that shows sort of the pay structure for each of those things and the steps you need to go through step by step to do those filings. Okay, one of the really important considerations here is, hey, suppose you formed an LLC or a corporation to take advantage of kind of that separate legal entity that shielding my personal assets from liability. That isn't automatic, right? So those protections aren't automatic. And courts may decide if you yourself haven't been treating this business as a separate legal entity, then they're going to hold you personally responsible for those business debts or lawsuits. And so that process of saying, yeah, you have formed this LLC or corporation, but you're still liable is kind of in the business law. Um, Circle called piercing the corporate veil. And the way to think about this is the court says if you own an LLC, but you've just been treating it like a personal checking account, then the law is going to treat it that way too. And so here are kind of the main ways that the court decides whether or not to pierce the corporate veil to hold you personally liable for the debts of the separate entity. If you've been intermingling your personal and business finances, so if you're using the business bank account to pay for groceries or a family vacation, the court might say this LLC or corporation isn't a real separate entity. If you haven't been doing kind of the appropriate record keeping, so, um, signing contracts under the business's name, filling out required paperwork, the court might decide that you're not treating it as a separate entity. If the business has debts or obligations that you haven't put enough funds in the business to cover those, um, the court might say that this separate entity doesn't exist, and if you've been failing to file taxes appropriately or pay fees appropriately, you may lose your liability protections. Okay. There are sort of so these are kind of the general considerations. There are some special considerations for agriculture in Oklahoma. So in a lot of states, you can use any kind of business entity you want to run a farm, sole proprietorship, LLC, corporation. In Oklahoma, we do have some restrictions on ownership. So Oklahoma has laws that say there are restrictions for corporate and LLC ownership of farmland and ranching operations, unless they meet some specific requirements, which I'll talk about here in a second. The reason to do that is not to be mean and sort of punish farmers in Oklahoma. It's to make sure that kind of farming in Oklahoma continues to be kind of a family operation rather than being taken over by big, large corporate farms dominating the industry. Okay, so what are those restrictions on ownership? So only certain people or types of entities can own LLCs or corporations in Oklahoma. Owners have to be natural persons, which just means an individual or a state or a trust. You can have corporations that are owners of a farm, but the owners of those corporations have to be individuals themselves. There are also revenue limits. So no more than 35% of the entity's annual revenue can come from off-farm sources. So you can't just you can't use an agricultural LLC to run other types of businesses outside of farming. And then there are shareholder limits. So corporations engaged in farming can't have more than 10 shareholders. An exception of that is that if all it can have kind of as many shareholders as it wants, as long as all of those shareholders are lineal descendants. So all children, grandchildren of the existing shareholders, just to make sure that we are supporting uh, family farms. There are exemptions around these limitations. So if you've got a livestock feeding operation, a lot of times you can be ruled exempt from these anti-corporate farming laws. So that's swine and poultry operations, but only if it's breeding stock, feed mills and processing facilities. Um, and then if you've got like a dairy operation or a processing operation, kind of any of those uh, processing operations involving agricultural products are likely exempt from those restrictions on direct farm ownership. Okay, and then one more big issue. As of January 2024, we've got these new requirements under the Corporate Transparency Act. Okay, so this is a federal law designed to prevent money laundering and fraud and a whole bunch of illegal financial activities. And it requires business entities to report something called beneficial owners to a department of the U.S. Department of Treasury called the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN. Okay, and so this is kind of a big deal because for the first time, even small businesses, including farmers and ranchers, if you've got an LLC or a corporation, you may be required to report who actually owns and controls the business. So who has to report here? If you own an LLC, a corporation, or a similar entity, you probably have to report. And if you're forming a new entity, you have 90 days from the date of filing to do this reporting. The kind of people who are exempt, large companies, so if you've got more than 20 full-time employees and more than $5 million in revenue, you're exempt from this reporting. If you're a sole proprietorship, you're exempt from this reporting because you're not a separate legal entity. If you're a partnership, you're exempt. Um, Otherwise, you do have to do this reporting. What is required under the reporting? You have to report to the FinCEN anybody who owns more than 25% of the business or has substantial control over the decisions of the business. And for each of those beneficial owners, you have to report their full name, their birth date, their address, and give an official ID, so either a driver's license or a passport. You have to report the company details, so business name, address, tax identification number. And then anytime any of this information changes, you have to update FinCEN with the updated information within 30 days of that change. If you don't do this, if you don't report, there are potentially big penalties. So the CTA says you can be penalized up to $500 per day for non-compliance and get potential criminal fees of up to $10,000. So if your business falls under those reporting requirements, which most of those LLCs and corporations do, it's important to do that filing on time. And I think, Josh, that's about all I've got. So the key takeaways here, choosing the right business entity is really important for managing your liabilities, your taxes, your long-term business sustainability and succession. Sole proprietorships and partnerships have the really nice benefit of being super simplistic, but they also have the risk of no liability protections. LLCs and corporations do offer that liability protection because they are separate legal entities. Um, Oklahoma has special rules for corporate and LLC farming, so make sure to check those laws before you form an entity. And the Corporate Transparency Act now does require reporting for LLCs and corporations to report ownership details to FinCEN. Okay, so then kind of the last point here, what should you do? So if you've already got a business entity, make sure that you are maintaining best practices so that you can kind of maintain those liability protections. Make sure you're meeting state and federal reporting requirements. If you don't yet have a business entity, I recommend talking with an accountant or an attorney just to make sure you understand what is the best structure for your farm or ranch. And if you're not sure what is the best option for you or you don't know who to talk to, there's a lot of resources available through Oklahoma State Extension, USDA, and the Small Business Development Center. Josh, I think that's all I've got.
Thank you, Dr. Schaefer. That was excellent. We do have a few questions if you're willing to stick around and chat a little bit with us about some of the questions we have from the audience. Just a quick reminder before we do address those questions. In the chat, I posted a resource that you may find helpful. It's actually chapter 3 from a larger document that we have called Farm Transitions. And it talks about just kind of reinforcing some of the things that Dr. Schaefer talked about today. It will go through each of the different types of legal entities and some of the pros and cons of those. So that may be a good reference for you to take home and dig into a little bit. So yeah, do note that. And then the first question is, does the C or the S in the two corporations mean anything specific? So referring to C Corp and S Corp.
They do, yeah. So S comes from, I believe, it's funny. I took all this stuff in my business law classes, and it's been so long ago. I believe these things come from the chapter of the Federal Register that they're found under. Shannon Farrell is our resident ag lawyer, so he'd be able to tell you what that regulation is formally. But I think that's just what it is, where it comes in the rules.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, can you change from one legal entity to another?
Absolutely, and it depends on kind of which legal entities you're trying to change from, right? So if you're going from sole proprietor to any of these LLC corporation, super easy to do. The sole proprietorship kind of just dissolves or vanishes in smoke as soon as you set up one of these formal entities. Going from sole proprietor to partnership happens instantaneously as soon as you've got kind of that partnership agreement, which is ideally written. Going from LLC to one of these other types of um, business entities can happen as well. I'm not exactly sure about the specific Oklahoma requirements. You may have to uh, dissolve and then kind of reconstitute under that new entity. But all of those things are doable. Once you've made a choice, you are not stuck under any of these business entities. You are not stuck kind of forever with that business entity option.
Okay, thank you. Um, we have a question regarding the recording links. So just to quickly address that, if you have registered for the webinar series, you will automatically with exactly 24 hours after this recording receive a recording link from today's session. However, if you, let's say you registered partway through the webinar series, like today is your first webinar that you've been registered for, then you can email me and I can have the other recording sent to you. So please do email me if you would like the other 2 weeks of recordings. And then they also will be cataloged under YouTube channel here in the coming weeks on the OSU Ag Econ YouTube channel. So um, please email me if you need those recordings. The next question is, there's a comment that says you can remember that an S corp is small business, C corp is big enough for a C-suite.
There you go.
The
That's
next
good.
question is, with an umbrella LLC with multiple subsidiaries, is there a safer way to go about it than if they all don't tie to farming? So if you have an umbrella LLC with multiple subsidiaries and they're not all associated with farming, is there
Mm.
is there a safer way to do it, such as if the farm LLC is owned by a gym?
If my farm LLC is owned by a gym. Okay, so yes, ish. It depends, right? So, um, if if the other operations make up more than 35% of the revenues of this LLC, that's potentially a problem. If the owners of your umbrella LLC are all kind of individuals, so humans, um, and there are, let's see, all U.S. citizens. Let me go back and check my notes here, but that also satisfies the exemption. So I think my answer is yes. I'm sure my answer is yes, it's okay. You can organize somehow. The specifics depend on your exact scenarios there. So let me just say those again. So if you have an umbrella LLC or corporation, the owners of that thing, to satisfy the Oklahoma anti-corporate farming law, the owners of that thing have to be individual persons. The revenue limits, no more than 35% of those annual revenues can come from non-farm sources. Um, and you're limited to up to 10 shareholders in the case of a corporation, unless you're all kind of lineal descendants.
Okay. Looks like we have at least one more question. The next question is, so there's a follow-up question from that question, Dr. Schaefer. It says, so 35% each person or as a whole.
35% of the revenues of the LLC.
The next question is it possible to run multiple enterprises with separate individual names under a single legal entity?
Is it possible to run multiple enterprises under separate names under, um, yes,
Be
I
like
don't totally
DVA
know.
or something?
I don't totally know what you mean by separate enterprises. Um, I guess it depends again. So this is sort of that anti-corporate farming restriction law, right? So it's the if these things are all engaged in farming, it should be okay. And if the ownership there um, satisfies those ownership restrictions, it should be okay. I don't
So
see
the
the
clarification on that was
question.
that
Yeah.
there's a cattle operation kind of runs as a separate enterprise from the chicken operation. They use separate names as like doing business, but they are all the same farm.
Great. That should be fine. Yep. So there's a distinction, I think, there between the doing business name and the business entity.
Looks like there's a follow-up question from Brian. It says 35% of revenue in the LLC is from the activities of the LLC and does not have to include off-farm income? Question mark. In regards to the earlier question with the umbrella LLC, the gym owns the farm.
Josh, help me understand this. 35% of revenue in the LLC is from the activities of the LLC and does not have to include off-farm income. I'm not exactly sure what you're asking. So the restriction, the Oklahoma restriction on farm ownership is that no more than 35% of your revenues for that LLC can come from off-farm activities.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So
That's
so an off-farm job is not part of the revenue for the LLC. Well, that,
correct.
yeah.
That's right. So if this is a job, yeah, let's so distinguish between you yourself as a human and the LLC, which is a separate legal entity, right? So if you yourself as a human have a job and you're making um, money, that doesn't count towards the revenues of the LLC because the LLC is a separate legal entity.
Yeah.
So this kind of goes back to if you've ever heard me talk about record keeping, financial record keeping, this also is part of why it's so important to separate personal finances and the farm. And so a lot of times we talk about the farm as its own person. And if you kind of think about the farm business that way, it really helps clear up some of this, what you're doing as a person versus what the LLC farm business is doing as its own person.
Yeah. That's great clarification. And we will touch on some of these types of topics in further in other sessions that are upcoming as well. Um, any other questions about organizing your business structure, your legal entities?
I think we always have the disclaimer on these too that you need to speak to your own attorney, your own accountant, your own tax preparer, because it does get confusing really quickly and individual situations can vary quite a bit. So that's kind of our, anytime we give these talks, that's kind of our disclosure of this is just so that you have the vocabulary to have an informed discussion with these professionals in your life, but we do really recommend that you have those professionals. And even if you're really small and starting out, it's great to start that relationship now. So you're not trying to undo things that were not done correctly.
Yeah, that's excellent. Every situation is going to have its own nuances and its own um, unique elements. And so, yeah, this session does not count as legal or financial advice. It is just information to help you make the best choice possible. I'm not seeing any other questions coming through in the chat. And so I think that I will go ahead and wind today's session down. If there's no other questions in the chat, I do want to thank Dr. Schaefer again for his time today. Really appreciate you sharing with us. Please capture, you can click on the link at the very, very top of today's chat. Second from the top of today's chat, I shared a resource, chapter 3.5 from our farm transitions document. We don't currently have a fact sheet, but inside this document, there is some information that talks about each of these legal entities types and some of the pros and cons of those. Reference that. And then for those of you that email me indicating you want the recordings from previous weeks, I will send those out to you as soon as I get that email from you. With that, thank you for joining us today. I'm going to stop recording.